So good morning everyone. Am I audible? Am I audible? Fine. So my name is Arafat and I teach history on the textbook platform. So in this session, let us discuss the fourth chapter of the eighth standard NCERT. The fourth, the chapter of the eighth standard NCERT. That is basically a chapter dealing with the tribals. A chapter dealing with the tribal revolts and tribal movements. That's my point. So once again, a very good morning, everyone. So this is a very important topic. Very often we get questions from this topic in the UPSC exam. So in the next half an hour or so, let us spend some time discussing some very important, tribal movements. In fact, more than focusing on the individual tribal movements, let us focus on who tribals are, what their lifestyle is, and let us try and understand why these people started revolting. That's my point. So basically, what we are discussing in this chapter is basically the revolts of the tribes. That is what we will be discussing in this particular chapter. Got my point. So without with this, let us go into this topic. So basically, the tribes, who are tribes in simple terms, these were the people who traditionally inhabited in the forested regions. That's the point. The forest regions happen to be their homes. They have been living in the forest since ages. That's the point. They are used to living in the forest. They some tribes live in regions close to that of a forest. Some tribes very much live deep inside the forest. Got my point. So tribes, these are basically the people who inhabited the forested regions. Got my point. And the point is, since they led, the point is these were the people who led a very isolated life. They very rarely interacted with the people of the plains regions. That's the point. Plains is basically the regions in which we inhabit, we live. So the tribes very rarely interacted with the people of the plains regions. So in other words, the tribes more or less led a very isolated life. That's my point. And as a result of their isolated life, their culture, their traditions. Let me repeat this point once again. The tribes, more or less, till recent times, led a very isolated life. They lived in the forested regions and sometimes deep inside the forested regions. And as a result of their isolated life, the tribes came to have their distinct culture, distinct customs and traditions, which were different from that of the people of the plains regions, or say their culture, that is the culture of the tribes, the culture of the tribes, the customs, the traditions were quite different from that of the Hindus. That's the point. So that's the point which I'm trying to convey. And even in terms of use of technology, they were primitive. Even with respect to the use of technology, they were primitive. How? The point is, unlike the people of the plains region who used plow, for cultivation, most of the tribal societies cultivated, most of the tribes, they resorted to a type of cultivation known as jhum cultivation. Let me repeat this point once again. I just told you who tribes are. I told you that these were the people who lived an isolated life. As a result, their customs, traditions, culture were quite different to that of the people of the plains regions. That is point number one. And second, even with respect to the use of technology, the the tribes were primitive. In other words, say the people of the plains regions used plough for cultivation, whereas the tribes were not aware of plough at all. They did not use plough at all. Instead, they carried agriculture, or they carried cultivation through a process known as jhum cultivation. Jhum is basically a shifting cultivation. Jhum is basically shifting cultivation. So, in shifting cultivation, what happens is the tribes used to clear a patch of forest. The tribes, they used to clear a patch of forest. That is, they would cut down trees from a patch of forest. And once the timber gets dried down, got your point. Once the timber, that is the branches of the trees which are cut, once they get dried up, they are burnt. Got your point. And over the ashes, the tribes used to just broadcast the seeds, that is scatter the seeds. Got your point. And after a few months, they would return to the same patch of land and take the harvest. In other words, sowing of the seeds was not done, sowing was not carried out, and no plough was used. Plough was not used, neither sowing was carried out by these tribes. In simple terms, they just used to clear one small patch of forest. Thereafterwards, they burned down the dried leaves and small branches of the trees, and over the ashes they just used to scatter or broadcast the seeds. A few months later they would return and collect the harvest. This was the type of cultivation which they carried out since ages. So the next year, this patch of land which was cut for cultivation was abandoned, and another new patch of forest was cut, and the same procedure was carried out to uh, for cultivation. Let me repeat. So the point is, year one, a small patch of forest was cleared, but after one cultivation, or say two crops, after two after one cultivation, after one cultivation season, the patch of land that was cut was abandoned, and the tribes moved to another patch of land. So since they kept shifting the areas where they cultivated, this type of cultivation came to be referred to as shifting cultivation. Got your point. But why did they resort to shifting cultivation? So the point is, since they were not using plough, what happens is, when you use plough, the minerals, the nutrients present in the soil comes on top. They support the plant growth. As a result, plant grows. But without plough, what happens is, deep ploughing is not possible, and as a result, the agricultural productivity in such areas will be very, very limited. So therefore, after one cultivation, the patch of land which was cleared for cultivation becomes fallow, and therefore that patch of land was abandoned, and the tribes moved to another patch of land. And since these tribes kept shifting the areas where they carried cultivation, at a point. So, such a type of cultivation came to be referred to as shifting cultivation. Second, many of the tribes were not even agriculturalists. I told you some tribes were into agriculture, but they practiced a type of agriculture called shifting agriculture, which I just explained. But many of the tribes were into hunting and gathering. They did not cultivate anything at all. They just used to hunt different animals available in the forest, and they lived on it. They used to gather the edible fruits, roots, tubers available in the forest. They ate them and they lived on it. So basically, many of the tribes were into hunting and gathering. Few of the tribes were into shifting cultivation. and a few of the tribes were into, some of the tribes were pastoralist. Some of the tribes were pastoralist. In other words, they depended on cattle rearing, etc., for their livelihood. So the point is, the tribes, one, they led an isolated life. Second, they they were primitive with respect to the use of technology. For example, this is basically the cultivation technology which I am referring to. So their cultivation technology was primitive. They were mostly hunter gatherers. And third, they were also into pastoralism. That is, some of the tribes were pastoralists. That's the point. Clear? Then what about the ownership of property? The point is, the concept of private ownership of the property was not known to the tribes at all. The point is, the concept of private ownership of the property was not known to the tribes at all, because the tribes believed in communal ownership. The tribes believed that all the resources available in the forest belong to all the members of the tribe. Say, for example, there are, say, 100 tribal families. So no tribal family, just a minute, no tribal family claimed any ownership to any of the resources present in the forest. They did not claim any ownership. In fact, all the resources available in the forest were believed to have been owned or belonged to all the members of the forest. Got my point? They did not own any resource. They did not even own land. Land was also believed to have been owned or belonged to all the members of the tribe. Then how about paying taxes? Did they anytime pay taxes to anyone? The point is, the tribes more or less led a very isolated life. Even during ancient and medieval times, the tribes never paid any kind of taxes to any rulers. That is, during ancient and medieval times, there were numerous kingdoms in India. Even during those times, the tribes did not pay any kind of taxes to anyone. That's the point. So the point is, and finally, they were not Hindus. The tribes, most of the tribes were not Hindus. They were basically nature worshippers. That's the point. I just told you in the beginning itself that their customs, their traditions, their culture was quite different from that of the mainstream Hindu population. I hope I am clear. So basically, they regarded the trees, the mountains, the rivers flowing in their regions where they inhabited as gods and worshipped them. They believed in nature worship. They were basically nature worshippers. And I told you, they led a very, very isolated life from the very beginning. That's the point. Just let me repeat this, what all happened. So who are tribes? I just tried to explain to you. Second, I told you that the tribes led a very isolated life. Third, I told you that they are primitive. Srilakshmi, any doubt? Do you have any doubt? Fine. In case you have any doubt, you may raise your doubt. So the whole point which I am trying to convey is, they were very, very primitive with respect to use of technology. They neither had the concept of the private ownership of the land. They paid no taxes to anyone in their entire life. That is, till the beginning of the British rule, they did not pay any taxes to anyone. Got your point? And their religion was also different. Got your point? So, got your point. So Lakshmi, I think your doubt will be clarified. Just be patient. This your problem will get clarified. That's the point. So the whole point is, this is the kind of life the tribals led till the beginning of the British rule in India. I just tried explaining to you. Uh, the lifestyle of the tribes till the beginning of the British rule. What all points I explained to you, it is the kind of life the tribes led till the beginning of, say, the 19th century AD. Roughly 19th century AD. Got your point? So the point is, with the beginning of the British rule, all of this, that is the kind of life the tribals led since the hundreds of years, all of that began to undergo a change. So the point is, the tribals, unable to bear with the changed circumstances, began to revolt against the British. The whole point which I'm trying to convey is, the tribes led a certain way of life, but with the beginning of the British rule, the way of life of the tribes changed completely. Unable to get adjusted with this changed circumstances, the tribes began to revolt against the British. Got my point? So now let us understand the causes of the outbreak of the tribal revolts. Why did the tribes revolt? What I just explained to you is the lifestyle of the tribes. Now let us take a look at the factors responsible for the outbreak of the tribal revolts. One is, the first reason is expansion of the British rule to the tribal areas. So the point is, first the British established their authority over the plains regions. Then afterwards, the British immediately began to establish their authority even to the tribal areas, even over the tribal areas. Let me repeat. The British came, I just told you that British conquest of India proceeded between 1757 to 1856. During this 100-year time period, the British established their control over the plains regions, but simultaneously the British also started establishing their control over the tribal regions. That is, the British began establishing their control over the forested regions. But why? Why were the British interested in establishing their control over the forested regions? There are a couple of reasons. One is, forests are the source of timber. So the British exported timber in large quantities to other parts of the world. The British also used the timber to lay the railway lines. Even to lay the railway lines, the same timber was used. So the point is, the forests are the rich sources of minerals. The forests are the rich sources of minerals. The forests also provided the British with large quantities of timber. In other words, the forest regions are a very good source of it is a very good basically forests are an important economic. Basically the forests are the forest uh, uh, it is an important source of wealth, and therefore the British, after establishing their control over the plains regions, began establishing their hold, establishing their control even over the forested regions. Got your point? Let me repeat this point once again. We are now discussing the reasons for the outbreak of the tribal revolts. The first reason is the expansion of the British rule to the tribal areas. I just told you the British first established their control over the plains. Then afterwards, they began extending their rule even to the forested regions. Reason? They did this because the British realized the economic importance of the forest, and therefore they began extending their rule to the forested regions. But the point is, this expansion of the British rule to the forested regions uh, created too many problems to the tribes. The expansion of the British rule to the tribal regions, to the forested regions, began creating too many problems to the tribes. For example, say the British began imposing and collecting various taxes from the tribes. So after extending their rule over the forested regions, the British began imposing and collecting various taxes from the tribes. So for example, grazing tax was collected. from the tribes by the British. So the British even started collecting taxes on the minor forest produce. The point is, the tribes, without taking permission from anyone, moved inside the forest and collected the minor forest produce. Say, for example, honey is an example of a minor forest produce which the tribes went inside the forest and collected without taking permission from anyone. But the British, they declared forest as their property, and thereafterwards the British started demanding the tribes to pay tax even for the minor forest produce. So for example, if the tribes collected honey, the British demanded that tax should be paid even on honey. This is an example of minor forest produce. Then importantly, the British introduced land revenue system. The British introduced land revenue system. Got your point? So the whole point is, I just told you that the tribes never paid any kind of land revenue to anyone till the beginning of the British rule. The tribes did not pay tax to the kings of the past. They paid nothing to anyone. But after the beginning of the British rule, the British began demanding land revenue payment from the tribes. They began demanding the tribes to pay the land revenue. That is basically the British began demanding that the tribes should be paying the land revenue. So basically the whole point is, the British till the tribes till the beginning of the British rule led a very free life. But after the beginning of the British rule, the problems of the tribes began to get multiplied. One, basically the British began to impose and collect various taxes from the tribes. These are the examples of taxes. Second, with the establishment of the British rule in the tribal areas, the liberty, the freedom of the tribes was taken away. After the expansion of the British rule to the tribal areas, the freedom available to the tribes was taken away. So, for example, the British the British banned shifting cultivation. For example, the British banned shifting cultivation. I hope I am clear. So, but the point is, shifting cultivation was the only the point is, the tribes were not aware of the other way of carrying out cultivation. The only way through which they cultivated they cultivated crops is a shifting cultivation. But the British, after they established their control over the forested regions, banned shifting cultivation. Second, the British even imposed restrictions on the movement of the tribes inside or into the forested regions. In fact, the British established a forest department at a point, and the forest officials began putting too many restrictions on the tribes. They began putting restrictions on the movement of the tribes into the forest. The forest officials began to put restrictions on the movement of the tribes into the forest. This is the second way. Third, the British, in fact, began interfering in the socio-cultural practices of the tribes. I told you the tribes had their own distinct culture and their own distinct culture. The tribes had their own distinct customs and traditions, but the British began to interfere in the socio-cultural matters of the tribes as well. Got your point? This was the third problem which the tribes began to face. Got your point? So just take a look at once again from the beginning what all I just discussed with you. I started discussing with you the reasons for the outbreak of the tribal revolts. One immediate reason, the important reason for the outbreak of the tribal revolts was the expansion of the British rule to the tribal areas. That's the point. So the British after establishing their control over the plains, uh, they established their control even over the forested regions, and this extension of the British rule to the forested regions began to bring too many problems, too many hardships to the tribes. One, the tribes paid no taxes to anyone in their entire life, but the British started demanding the tribes to pay the taxes. The British began demanding the tribes to pay different taxes. This is the first problem which the tribes began to face. Second, the liberty, the freedom that was available to the tribes was also began to be taken away by the British. How? Basically, shifting cultivation was banned by the British. Second, the tribes, they lived in the forest since ages, but the British began to impose restrictions on the movement of the tribes into the forested regions. So this is how the British began restricting the liberty, or the British began taking away the liberty of the tribes. And third, see, the British even began to interfere in the socio-cultural matters of the tribes. Got the point. Fourth, take a look at the second major problem which the tribes began to face. What we discussed is point number 1. Come to point number 2. So after the expansion of the British rule to the tribal areas, let me repeat, after the expansion of the British rule to the tribal areas, many non-tribals also began to move close to the forest and began to settle down there. After the expansion of the British rule to the tribal areas, many non-tribal outsiders also began to move closer to the forested regions and began to settle down there. For example, say various traders or businessmen began to get settled down near to the top the tribal areas. Second, the money lenders also began to get settled down close to the top of the tribal areas. Let me repeat this point once again for you. The point is, after the expansion of the British rule to the tribal areas, various or many non-tribal outsiders also began to move closer to the forested regions and began to settle down there. Who are these non-tribal outsiders? One is we have traders, and second is money lenders. So why did these non-tribal outsiders settle down close to the forested regions? Basically, these non-tribal outsiders settled down close to the forested regions because of the British policy. They settled down because of the British policy. Which policy? Basically, the British introduced the land revenue payments in the tribal regions. The British basically introduced land revenue payment in the tribal regions, and moreover, the British made it compulsory for the tribes to pay the land revenue only in terms of cash. The point is, the British, I told you, the tribes did not pay any taxes to anyone till the beginning of the British rule. One, the point is, the British introduced land revenue payments even in the tribal areas. That's all right. But the British made it compulsory for the tribes to pay the land revenue only in terms of cash. So, for example, I am a tribe. I cultivate 100 bags of paddy, but the British demanded that the land revenue payment should be made only in terms of cash. That is, maybe the British might have fixed 100 rupees as a tax on me. So, for example, I am a tribe. I have cultivated 100 bags of paddy, but yearly I was required to pay 100 rupees as a tax to the British. What do? I go to the market. I take the goods which I have produced. I take my produce to the market and sell the same in the market. I make money and use the same money to pay tax to the British. This is what I do. So earlier I paid taxes to none, but the British made tax payments compulsory. That is point number 1. And second, the British made tax payments compulsory only in terms of cash. So therefore, what all I have produced, I began taking the same to the market. Got my point? And therefore, over a period of time, numerous non-tribal outsiders began to come close to that of the forest and began to settle down near to that of the forest. Example, traders. So, for example, traders settled down close to that of the forest because of the British policy. Because of the British policy of making land revenue payments compulsory only in terms of cash. That's the point. I hope I am clear. So the point is, various traders began to get settled down close to the tribal forested regions, and similarly, various money lenders began to get settled down close to that of the forested regions. And these two communities, mind you, the traders and money lenders, also began to exploit the tribes. Mind you, tribes are very, very ordinary people. They had no education. Their outlook towards life was very, very simple. That's the point. So, uh, cheating tribes was very, very easy, because the tribes really, for example, the tribe might have collected honey whose real value, whose market value maybe say 100 rupees per kg. But the traders purchase the same honey from the tribes at maybe 10 rupees per kg. That's all. Since the tribes were not aware of its actual price in the market, the traders began to cheat the tribes. So the whole point which I'm trying to convey is the tribes were very ordinary people. They were very innocent people. They really do not know how things go about in the society, and therefore these non-tribal outsiders who began to get settled down close to that of the forested regions began to cheat, began to exploit the tribes. So the exploitation of these non-tribal outsiders became the second reason for the tribal revolts. I tried explaining to you the reasons for the tribal revolts. The first reason is the tribes got fed up with the British rule. Second, the tribes also got fed up with the exploitative practices of the non-tribal outsiders. Examples of non-tribal outsiders: one is the traders, second is the moneylenders. So the tribes called both of these non-tribal outsiders as Dikus. So that common term by which the non-tribal outsiders were referred to by the tribes was Dikus. What is Diko? Diko is a common term which was used by the tribes to refer to the non-tribal outsiders. These are the one. Mind you, the traders and moneylenders, these are very much Indians only. They are very much Indians only. They are not British people. That's the point. But they began to get settled down close to that of the forest, and they began in turn exploiting these tribes. Third, take a look at the activities of the Christian missionaries. So during the British times, the Christian missionaries were quite active, and they were very, very actively carrying out religious conversions. And the Christian missionaries, uh, the Christian missionaries uh, basically began making efforts to promote Christianity among the tribes. I told you, tribes were nature worshippers. They worshipped the trees, the hills, the rivers available in their region. They considered the trees, the hills, and rivers of their region as their gods. They worshipped. They lived a very happy life. But the Christian missionaries, they began, that is, the Christian missionaries were very active during the British times. They had the agenda, they had their own agenda of promoting their religion, and they basically uh, uh, began making attempts to promote Christianity among these tribal groups. Because the tribal groups, these tribal people are very humble, very, very innocent people, the Christian missionaries were of the view that promoting their religion among these tribal communities is very easy, and therefore the Christian missionaries began making repeated attempts to promote their religion among the tribes. So the activities of the Christian missionaries also was not liked by the tribes. So basically, the tribes were fed up from three different sections. The tribes were fed up from three different sections. One is the British. The British rule brought them so many problems. The British rule took away their liberty. The British rule made the tribes pay taxes compulsorily to the British. Second, with the beginning of the British rule, various non-tribal outsiders also began to get settled down close to that of the forest. For example, traders and moneylenders. These two communities, that is the traders and moneylenders, began to exploit. They began to exploit the tribes. Got your point? So the second reason for the tribal revolts is the exploitative practices of the non-tribal outsiders. Third, the tribes, I told you, had their own unique customs and traditions. They mostly were nature worshippers, but the Christian missionaries were very active in the tribal areas. They were making repeated attempts to promote their religion among the tribes, which also began to be resisted by the tribes. So the third reason for the tribal revolt was the activities of the Christian missionaries. I hope I am clear. So the whole point which I am trying to convey is the tribes were fed up with these three sections of the society. They were fed up with the British. They were fed up with the non-tribal outsiders. They were also fed up with the activities of the Christian missionaries. And from the beginning of the 19th century itself, the tribes began to revolt against these three sections of the society. That's the point. So, in fact, the first community to fight back or fight against the British happened to be the tribes only. The first section or the first community of India who took up arms and started fighting against the British happened to be the tribes only. So, why did the tribal revolts begin? These are the three reasons. So, the tribal revolts began either as a result of the exploitation carried out by the British, or due to the exploitative practices of the non-tribal outsiders, or due to the activities of the Christian missionaries. That's the point. So take a look at this picture. So you have so many tribal communities spread across the country. Mostly you see many tribes in central India and in central India, East India and Northeast India is home to numerous tribal communities. So these tribal communities began to revolt against the British on a very large scale. That's the point. So, for example, in 1810 itself, the Mizos revolted. I just told you from the beginning of the 19th century itself, the tribals started revolting. So, Mizos, they revolted in 1810. So, Kols, these are the tribes of the Jharkhand region, the Kols, they revolted many times. The Mundas, they revolted many times. Got my point. The Mundas is another very important tribal community of Jharkhand. It also revolted. Got my point. So Santhal in 1853, once they revolted, in 1856 also they revolted. The 1856 they revolted. Got my point. So the whole point which I'm trying to convey is many tribal communities began to revolt against the British or against the activities of the non-tribal outsiders, or they started revolting against the activities of the Christian missionaries, or a combination of any of the three. A combination of any of the three, or a combination of all of the three. This is what happened. Fine. So I tried explaining to you in the last half an hour or so, why did the tribals revolt? I first explained to you who tribals are. I tried explaining to you that the tribals were they are the one who inhabit the forested regions. Their customs and traditions are quite different. Their their uh, 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 they basically uh, their religious practices are quite different. That's the point. So They are primitive with respect to the use of technology. I also explained this. But all of this changed. Their entire life changed with the beginning of the British rule. Got my point? So I explained to you how the British exploited them. I explained to you how the non-tribal outsiders exploited them. And I told you, I discussed with you how they also began to suffer as a result of the activities of the Christian missionaries. Basically, the Christian missionaries were forcing these tribes to get converted to Christianity, which was not to their liking, and hence they started revolting against them as well. And in 19th and 20th century, we see numerous tribal revolts. All of these tribal revolts happened due to any of the three reasons which I just discussed with you. Whatever tribal revolts that have happened in India in the 19th and 20th century happened because of any of the three reasons which I just discussed with you. That's all. Anyone, any doubt? Yes, Sri Lakshmi. First, they started revolting against the British. They revolted. For example, take a look at this Santhal revolt 1856. This Santhal revolt initially was a revolt only against the outsiders, the non-tribal outsiders. Initially, the Santhal revolt of 1856 was a revolt only against the non-tribal outsiders. But after some time, the Santhals also turned against the British. They also turned against the British. At no point. Take the case of the Mundas. Basically, in 1899, not 99, this is 1899, the Mundas revolted on a very large scale against the British in 1899. At a point. So, the Munda revolt was a revolt against the activities of Christian missionaries. It was a revolt against the non-tribal outsiders. It was also a revolt against the British. So sometimes you see the tribals revolting against all the three exploiters. Sometimes you see tribes revolting against all three exploiters, as has happened in the case of the Mundas. In the case of Santals, the revolt was not against the Christian missionaries. It was mostly against the non-tribal outsiders and the British. Got my point. Sometimes you see, say for example, the Khond. In 1817, the Khonds revolted. The Khonds are basically the tribes of Odisha. So the Khonds revolted not against Christian missionaries, not against non-tribal outsiders. They revolted mostly against the British. They revolted against the activities of the British. Got my point. So the point, this is the point. Is this point clear to you, Lakshmi? I think the doubt which you raised earlier is now clarified. Is your doubt clear, Sri Lakshmi? The point which you raised earlier. Anyone, any doubts? Any more doubts, anyone? Fine. So that's all for today. See you in the next class. Tomorrow we will meet. Day after tomorrow we will have our session and I will take up a discussion on some other topic. That's all for today. See you in the next class.